tanto. ¿Lo vemos un poco? ¿Lo ves un poquito o qué? No se escucha bien, perdón. Claro, está en inglés todo, tú. Claro, no había caído en esto. Pero yo creo que lo podemos ver si hay traductor. Para que lo entendáis todo, es que, claro, es un poco putada para la gente que no entienda. ¿Dónde hay Spanish? Mierda, tío, es que siempre buscas o Spanish o español. Pues me he equivocado. Toca buscar español. ¿Sabes?
Some of you may know parts and pieces of its world record progression. The story this game has crafted over the last 7
Esto no se
years
hacía en el
is
world
nothing
record, ¿sabes?
short of incredible. So I think
7 años de Odyssey. Somos viejos, tío. Somos viejos, tío.
it's finally time that we went through the great lengths of capturing the full history of what might possibly be Mario's most iconic speedrun.
Estoy de acuerdo, tío.
This is the history of Super Mario Odyssey
Estoy de acuerdo,
World
tío.
Records.
O sea, ya sé, el del Mario 64 y tal es muy mítico, pero como es todo glitches, a mí no me gusta tanto de ver, ¿sabes?
Just a few years after Odyssey's release, people had thought the game was dead, but these people couldn't have been any more wrong. But before we get to that crucial point in time, I have a quick word from today's sponsor, which is Manscaped.
Manscaped, bueno, sponsor, gente.
Manscaped for a long time, I was
Esto no sé ni lo que es, pero esto lo tenéis que ver en su canal, gente. Y clicar el link en su descripción. Es una maquinilla de afeitar.
To no one's surprise, this new 3D Mario platformer did not disappoint and was met with critical acclaim across every major video game.
Es que, tío, qué juegardo, tío, de verdad. Esto es uno de esos juegos que me gustaría olvidarlo entero. Perder toda mi habilidad en el juego, me la pela, tío, para volverlo a jugar de cero, ¿sabes?
Critical acclaim was Mario's moveset. Through clever use of this moveset, players would find seemingly impossible secrets such as these coins in Sand Kingdom or these coins in Darker Side. Essentially, the game would almost always reward you for stepping way outside of the box, which not only paved the way for some sensational moments, but it partially served as a catalyst for a question that the Odyssey community has now been trying to answer for the last 7 years. How fast could you beat the entire game? It's a simple question, but if you know anything about speedrunning, you'll know that the answer is always complicated. With that being said, people were already
el 64 se hace tan rápido, tío.
On the day of Odyssey's release, and the person to come on top.
Es que además, tío, este juego tiene una duración de speedrun muy buena. O sea, sobre 1 hora. Menos de 2 horas ya es muy buena, pero es que ni siquiera es 1 hora y media, tío. Es 1 hora y poco. Es una duración de speedrun muy buena. Mira, este es de los primeros. 1:53.
46. Since that had only been a day since Odyssey was available to the public, you can bet that this world record was nothing more than a fast casual playthrough of the game that would get beaten to a pulp over the course of the next few weeks. Every day,
quiero ver cuánto baja en un par de semanas, tío.
With some days seeing multiple.
Un día después, 1:23. Que es poco más de lo que me hago yo, tío.
World records. Among all the players who were grinding Odyssey at the time, Nintendo would have a streak of dominance,
1:20, 1:19, 1:18,
all the way down to a 1:18.15 a week after the game had come out.
En una semana hacen mi tiempo, tío. En una putísima semana. La gente está loquísima con los speedruns, te lo juro.
Next week, Valu, who was already a legendary speedrunner, began to dominate the leaderboards, and he brought the world record all the way down to a 1:10.43. How had the world record already gotten so low, even though there haven't been any notable glitches discovered yet? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand both how Mario's moveset operates alongside how the any% run operates. Any% simply means beating the game as fast as possible under any means possible. The game is considered to be beaten after you defeat Bowser in Moon Kingdom, and the actual speedrun ends when you exit this wire at the end of the
Cuando dejas de tener control de Mario.
Getting to the Moon Kingdom means that you have to go through 13 other kingdoms first, and each of these kingdoms have a certain amount of moons you need to collect before moving on to the next kingdom. If you include the kingdoms you unlock after you beat the game, there are 880 moons to collect, but about half of these moons are locked behind these moon rocks, which are only accessible in Odyssey Odyssey's post-game. But since you only need to collect 124 total moons to unlock Moon, most kingdoms have the luxury of speedrunners being able to entirely skip the kingdom's main missions. For example, in Sand Kingdom, a casual player would usually do these 2 story moons to unlock this inverted pyramid, and from there, they would fight this boss, which would then unlock this entire underground section with another boss.
En Sand Kingdom hay muchísimas lunas de historia. O sea, si tú te vas directo a las lunas de historia sin pillar prácticamente ninguna otra cosa, prácticamente has acabado el reino. Te faltan como 6 o 7 lunas, como mucho, ¿sabes? O sea, te da 3, te da 3 más la Harriet, luego está la de arriba del tubo y está la de los Moais. Son 10 lunas ya. Y creo que te pide como 18, ¿no? Por ahí. O sea, imagina. Y eso si no has encontrado ninguna por el camino. O sea, es un mundo tremendo para comenzar. No sé si se me olvidará alguna por ahí, pero bueno.
If you were to do all of this fast, it would still end up taking around 10 to 15 minutes because there are a lot of unskippable cutscenes and animations, not to mention that doing a 2-minute boss fight or challenge is not worth it.
Por cierto, ya existe el mod que quita todas las animaciones del Odyssey. Cuando esté nos pasaremos el Odyssey con 0 animaciones, que va a ser satisfactorio.
When you can easily collect a plethora of moons in that same time period. With some good routing, you are able to skip some of, if not all of the slow story moons in each kingdom, which is where a lot of the time save was at in the first.
Pero imagínate cómo estará de optimizado esto, que cargarte al Speedrun, que son 3 lunas, es lento. Solo por el tiempo de animación, ¿sabes?
Conjunction with the moon routes comes Mario's moveset, as his moveset not only allows for some of the route to be possible in the first place, but it allows the route to be optimized to its fullest potential. In addition to your classic backflips, side flips, dives, and triple jumps, we now also had rolling, which if done with motion controls, allows for you to cross most distances in a timely manner. Then there's Cappy, who essentially has his own moveset in addition to Mario's already
¿Cómo me mola esta zona,
Not only can you bounce
ese mod también quita las conversaciones con Cappy, sí, es la polla.
You can also do homing cap throws, up throws, and spin throws with Cappy, all of which help you save time in their own unique ways. You can also do down throws if you're playing on Joy-Cons, but these don't really save any time.
Tío, me da una rabia que los down throws solo se puedan hacer con los Joy-Cons. O sea, literalmente no hay ningún motivo para no haber añadido ese movimiento al mando Pro. No hay ni un solo motivo, porque yo me he configurado el mando Pro para que el Mario se piense que son los Joy-Cons y puedo hacer down throws. Y literalmente no cambia absolutamente nada, ¿sabes? Entonces es como, tío, ¿por qué, sabes? ¿Por qué, tío?
As far as any percent is concerned, and we can't forget about the actual captures themselves, as they are present all throughout the run.
Y me daría igual hacer un down. Me estoy acostumbrando ya de vez en cuando a hacer down throws y tal. Chavino. Pero hay trucos como el bout facilito ¿cómo se llama? El bout cómodo, que requiere hacer un down throw, ¿sabes? Entonces es como, joder, tío, Nintendo, ¿qué más te daba que con el mando Pro se haga igual?
Mario's moveset, the captures in the route are 4 out of the 5 foundations for an Odyssey world record. The 5th and final foundation would be none other than the glitches and tricks. While Value's 110.3 didn't contain any glitches, it did contain some pretty neat tricks and even some sequence breaks. At the end of Cap Kingdom, Valu fights Topper, but after he gets the first hit, he immediately stomps on the hat Topper is in, as opposed to waiting for Topper to pop out of his hat.
Eso se descubrió cuando, tío.
Similar strategies.
Buah, es que las strats de todos los brothers, las speed strats de todos los brothers son la hostia, tío. Y que eso esté programado por Nintendo también me parece la hostia, porque al final, o sea, Nintendo ha programado que da igual en el momento que sea, tú le puedes soltar el sombrero a Rango, ¿sabes? Para sacarlo de de ese modo, tío. Y eso está hecho por Nintendo y eso es una maravilla.
To go through this 2D section to get to the top of the kingdom where the Madam Brood boss fight is.
Buah, tiene esquive.
This dinosaur and bounce off of this trampoline, you are able to go straight to the boss fight and save a minute. In Sand Kingdom, you are supposed to go through this underground section to make it up to this treasure moon with the Jaxi, but Valu skips all of that with a bullet bill and a well-timed wall jump, making this treasure moon a quick one to collect. In Lost Kingdom, Klepto is supposed to take your hat away, but if you do a triple jump off of this tree to this part of the kingdom and then go to these stairs where you would usually defeat Klepto, what will happen is that the game will be tricked into thinking that Klepto already has your hat, so now you are able to go wherever you want in Lost Kingdom without the Klepto sequence triggering itself. This in itself saved upwards of a minute. In Metro Kingdom, a faster way of getting to the boss fight was discovered. It involved jumping up this awning, which would then put you at the top of this building. From there, you could not only route in this moon, but you could quickly hop from building to building to get to the city hall and ultimately the Mecha Wiggler boss fight, as opposed to the alternative,
es que la parte de Metro Noche es horrible, tío.
In Bowser's Kingdom, Valu cleanly executes a faster version of the mech boss fight.
Qué bueno, por la rodilla, tío.
Bombs with the Pokio, he skips capturing the Pokio entirely by climbing up the mech's leg.
Qué bueno. El que descubrió esto, Jesucristo también, Lo de mantenerse dentro del mecha lo hice yo en mi primera run también. Era en plan de, creo que es más fácil mantenerse ahí que hacer todo lo demás.
In Moon Kingdom, it was discovered that you could skip the entire Moon Cave by doing this cat bounce followed up by these wall jumps.
El Moon Skip también es una brutalidad.
It wasn't too difficult, and at the time, a few failed attempts
didn't hurt,
considering that this easily saves minutes in comparison to going through the Moon Cave. In just a week, Valu had brought the world record down from a 1:18:51 all the way down to a 1:10:43. This 1:10 had a handful of mistakes, but it was clear that Valu was onto something magical here. He was already a speedrunning legend, having held world records in Super Mario 3D World and the Super Mario Galaxy games, among many other impressive times to his name. But right behind Valu were two more speedrunning juggernauts. One had held world records in Super Mario Sunshine, while the other had held world records in various Zelda titles. These players were respectively Samurai 1Man and Iwabi74. Just one day after Valu's record, Iwabi would get a new record of 1:10:22, but Valu would quickly clap back with a new world record. But this wasn't just a new world record, it was an improvement by over a minute. There were no new big discoveries. Valu had simplemente
haciéndolo bien, ¿no?
In every single kingdom.
Eso mola, o sea, es como alguien descubre todo eso y hace el world record y de pronto llega alguien y lo hace todo perfecto y se ahorra un minuto, tío.
With the exception of Bowser's Kingdom, in which he lost about 20 seconds to the Harriet boss fight. Had this gone right, he would have been the first to get a 1:08. It was now the middle of November.
Cada vez que bajas en la comunidad de Odyssey, cada vez que bajas de un minuto, ¿sabes? Aquí, por ejemplo, 1:08, 1:07, 1:06, es un hito. Es un hito. Y cada vez está siendo más chuco, pero imaginaos que ahora están 56, ¿sabes?
Valu, Samurai 1Man, and Iwabi were all doing attempts in the hopes of getting the first ever 1:08. People had their money on Iwabi or Valu since they were significantly closer to it than Samurai was. So naturally, Samurai got a new world record of 1:08:48. This run was 20 seconds behind Valu.
O sea, 12 segundos por debajo, tío.
Kingdoms, but thanks to a clean Harriet fight alongside a cleaner endgame overall, he was able to absolutely crush the world record. With it now being the middle of November, Mario Odyssey speedrunning had truly become a spectacle. All of these runners were averaging hundreds of viewers while doing attempts, and if someone was on world record pace, then thousands of people would flood into the person's stream to catch the record live. The three speedrunners would continue cleaning up the run, with Iwabi getting the first ever 1:07 just 9 days after the first 1:08. But by the end of November, there was a new world record, and it wasn't by Iwabi, it wasn't by Samurai, and it wasn't by Valu. This player went by the name of NDS, which is backwards for Shaden, and Shaden had seemingly come out of nowhere, beating Iwabi's record by 15 seconds. Valu would once again clap back with a low 1:07, but after that, Shaden would start to dominate the game, getting times that were leagues better than even second place. Before Shaden's first world record, no one had any idea who he was. His account online was fresh, and he had no history or background, unlike the other 3 speedrunners. When situations like these happen, they usually call for some sort of investigation, because someone unknown getting a world record like this out of nowhere is usually seen as suspicious by community members. I'm not saying that a new person with little experience can't get a world record, but when the last 3 players were all speedrun veterans, it definitely raised some eyes within the community. After some investigation,
muchas veces la comunidad se ciega, ¿no? En plan de esto es lo que hay que hacer. Pero claro, llega Peña que no sabe que eso es lo que hay que hacer, igual se busca su propio método y encuentra algo más rápido, ¿sabes? Ahora ya muy difícil con un juego de 7 años, pero en el primer año, vamos, ¿sabes?
Completely legitimate, and there was no doubt about it. The second thing was that Shaden had a past account that went under the name of Pydoix, and Pydoix was the best Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time speedrunner in the entire world. He had gotten multiple world records in Ocarina of Time in 2013.
El cabrón iba ahí de incógnito y dijo, pensaste que era un incógnito, pero era yo, cabrón.
But because of Odyssey, he was back under the username of Shaden.
Buah.
That was pretty good.
¿Ha hecho este salto para...? Esto no es más rápido. Ha hecho este salto para ahorrarse el cable eléctrico, pero eso no es más rápido, ¿sabes?
That was pretty good. Still want that
1.06. 1.05 3 días después. ¡Qué animal!
Alright, forgot the 105 I wanted.
Casi 0.4. Tío, va a ser World Record y se la pela. Qué barbaridad de gente.
World record all the way down to a low 105 in the span of just 2 weeks. An up-and-coming player by the name of Nigrovita would tie his time not long afterwards, but other than that, Shaden was becoming the undisputed champion of Odyssey. The most impressive part about all of this was that there weren't any new glitches or big tricks discovered during this time period, except for one. Shaden would be one of the first players to start utilizing Odyssey's more advanced techniques, whether it be motion control throws with Cappy or spin pounds, which are essentially faster but more complicated ground pounds.
¿No se usaban spin pounds hasta ahora?
Wow. As you have to rotate your entire analog stick for a spin,
wow,
and then quickly follow it up with the inputs of a ground pound. But there was one more technique implemented into every top level runner's arsenal, and that was the roll cancel. If you press the jump button and the cap throw button at the same time while in the middle of a roll, you will be able to exit the roll without losing any speed. This was insanely useful because beforehand, players would either just let go of the crouch button to get out of a roll, or the long jump out of a roll, which was even slower. With the roll cancel, you not only preserve the speed from the rolls, but you were also able to effectively change your direction, not to mention that you could combine the roll cancel with other movement techniques, such as the cap return, which gives your jump a boost in height upon execution. But the roll cancel had one more
básicamente roll cancel se basa en la mitad de los trick jumps, ¿sabes? En hacer un buen roll cancel.
Clip straight through it.
Wow. Y el roll cancel descubrió los clips.
That there are certain walls you could roll cancel through, even if there was no sloped surface. But these walls are merely special cases, as they are either poorly designed or there's some other property at play. Regardless, a lot of roll cancels
se usa en el World Peace.
Would be implemented here in Sand Kingdom.
El de Sand, este será el más importante seguramente.
So that they could get this treasure chest moon, and then after that they would sink all the way down in the sand to get this moon.
Es que lo que tiene esta luna es que se puede conseguir desde aquí fuera. O sea, tú estando out of bounds sin tener que salir de esta pared, estando dentro de esta pared, puedes tocar esta luna. Entonces la tocas y te vas hacia la esfinge, ¿sabes?
With the rest of the route. But if you did this roll cancel on top of the Sphinx, specifically on the left side of the Sphinx's back, in which there is this sloped curvature, then you could clip straight through the wall, and then dive straight into the loading zone that leads you to the treasure chest moon. When Shaden got his first world record time of 107.39, he was the first person to get a world record with Sphinx clip, even though players hadn't even fully understood how to make the trick consistent yet. Nonetheless, a first try sync split saved almost 10 seconds, so it was most certainly worth going for, especially at a world record level. During the same time period, two more notable strategies were implemented into runs. In Cloud Kingdom, players would usually wait for Bowser to throw out his hat before collecting it, but if you did a jump and cap throw while Bowser was in the middle of throwing out his hat, then you are able to collect it.
A mí nunca me sale esto. Esto es las cosas más inconsistentes que he hecho alguna vez.
As opposed to collecting the hat farther away like this. This in itself saved 10 seconds, but since you also fight Bowser in Moon Kingdom, you get an additional 10 seconds of time saved for doing fast hats there as well. In Metro Kingdom, there's this moon that players would get with the RC card, but it was discovered that if you got on the scooter,
el cambio de ruta me flipa, es que eso es la hostia.
What would happen is that the scooter's hitbox would extend itself ever so slightly.
So a mí por eso me gusta tanto el speedrun de este juego, tío.
Then the hitbox is barely able to reach the moon, allowing for you to collect it with which saves a few seconds over the RC car. 104 was on the horizon, and since Shaden was still actively playing the game, already having been the first to get a 105
y el de aquí, claro.
It seems as if he was going to be the first to break this barrier as well. In a time where the game was seeing a world record almost every day, Shaden was so far ahead of everyone at the time that it took someone
este era básicamente el Tyron de la época, gente. Para que lo entendáis. 21 días con el world record.
The first person to actually beat him would be none other than Valu, who'd get the first ever 104 alongside the first world record of 2018. Going into Luncheon Kingdom, Valu was already 23 seconds ahead of Shaden. He could have very easily played it safe to secure the world record, but instead he went for a new trick that had just been discovered.
Sí, hombre,
Getting this moon in Luncheon was a huge pain, as you'd have to use this Panbro to break open this
estoy de acuerdo, porque yo cuando hago el speedrun uso esto y es putísima mierda, tío. Pues claro, el truco es súper jodido si no, ¿sabes?
Los
vectores, ya ves. Supongo que cuando a este clip, me acuerdo de este clip. Ah, este está guapísimo, en verdad,
barrier and then drop the Panbro in between the barrier and turn
y lo captura, es como lo del pez en Seaside, un poco bastante más complicado, ¿no? Pero pam, ahí dentro.
Shaden would immediately learn this trick and take the world record back from Valu the very next day. But at this point, Shaden would only do any percent if the world record got taken away from him, since he was still invested in doing 2
es en plan de solo volvía a intentar sacarse el récord cuando alguien le superaba.
With Icatrix, so once again, it would take a few weeks for everyone invested in only do any percent if the world record got taken away from him, since he was.
Esto solo se podía hacer en la 1.0 del juego, porque en la 1.0 si tú te saltabas esa luna, la que deja caer este puente, podías seguir jugando y podías llegar a Madame Brodal y Madame Brodal hacían su batalla, pero en la 1.3 eso dejó de pasar.
Still invested in doing 2P runs with Icatrix, so once again, it would take a few weeks for everyone to catch up to him. This time, Nitro would be the first to dethrone Shaden, but within the same day, Shaden sniped the world record back from him. 1 week later, one speedrunner.
Sí, en su época eran la hostia, ¿sabes? Y ahora es como es que prefiero lo que tiene la 1.3 del Mario Odyssey es que los tiempos de carga son más cortos. Entonces a la gente le convenía jugar en la 1.3 y tener que hacer lo de bajar el puentecito ese, ¿sabes? Del chomp, de Cascade, a saltárselo en la 1.0 y luego comerse todos los tiempos de carga.
Third run. They were already 15 seconds ahead of the record with time to save in the second half. In Snow Kingdom, they got a gold split, meaning that was the best they'd ever completed that kingdom.
Menos 23,
even though they lost some time in Luncheon, they were now 25 seconds ahead of the record going into the final 2 kingdoms. Under this type of pressure, you'd expect some time loss as a result of nerves, but instead, this runner got a gold split again, this time in Bowser's, and then closed out the run with a 104-20,
es que yo estaría súper nervioso y no podía jugar tranquilo, ¿sabes?
Shaden's record.
420, let's go!
420! Hey, 420!
This record was so good that it would stand for an entire month, which is the longest a record had stood thus far. 103 was possible, but unless there was a new strategy found, then it was looking like this was going to be the record for a while. But then Shaden came back, and without any big discoveries...
Yo me acuerdo que antes de Tyron hubo un chaval, que era un chaval que tenía 16 años, que fue el que empezó a bajar tiempo muy seriamente, cuando ya todo se había establecido un poco.
He not only get the record,
supongo que eso lo explicará ahora, ¿no?
First 103. He had managed to not only clean up all the mistakes in Nicro's record, but he had also managed to have cleaner and faster movement throughout the entire run, even if his run had a few small flaws of its own.
Hostia, así se hacía antes él por la izquierda.
11 seconds off of his own record just 3 days later, but after this 103.47, Shaden would disappear, just like how he did in 2013 with Ocarina of Time.
Ahí está Shaden, gente. F.
6 years later, and no one in the Odyssey community really knows what he's up to, but I'd like to think that he is thriving in real life while secretly being a world record holder in a different game.
Puede ser, claro. Si se cambia el nombre cada juego que juegas, ¿sabes?
Would also start to move away from Mario Odyssey any %, but don't be mistaken about this game's activity. Despite the first generation of Odyssey runners straying away,
esa es la primera generación,
new generation would come and pave the way for a golden era. Nicro would continue to bring the world record down through the months of March and April, getting a time of 103.16 before Sui Saga, would get his first world record with a time of 103.14. The both would continue to optimize their movement, and on the same day Sui got his first world record, Nicro would get on a world record run of his own. It was 102 pace into the
es que se iban bajando el tiempo continuamente entre varios, tío.
Equan said it was a 103 flat, it ended up being a 103 flat. While movement optimizations would continue to persevere, a new trick that saved almost 20 seconds was discovered. Upon collecting this first moon in Cascade,
eso se descubrió ahora.
Plunged into this long cutscene, followed by another cutscene before you are able to get to this dino. If you try to skip this first moon, you'll be met with this invisible
La
wall.
estúpida es que saltarse,
Es
que no hay otra forma de hacerlo, tío.
Movement, then you're able to just barely go over the invisible wall.
Oye, ese salto,
people found out that it was actually
el Suboro en su momento fue lo más bestia. Ya. Me acuerdo, tío. Era una barbaridad. Pero Subora sigue siendo una locura, ¿eh? No sé, Subora ahora mismo, ¿cuántas personas lo tienen? Speedrun.com. A ver. Subora ahora mismo lo tienen... Hostia, ha subido bastante. Pero lo tienen menos de 100 personas. En un juego con 4.300 runs... El Subora lo tienen menos de 100 personas, tío, que son 4 minutos. O sea, el Subora sigue siendo una bestialidad. De difícil, ¿no?
To bypass the wall by going under and around it like this, but for now, this was the primary method of doing the trick, and it was working wonders when it came to bringing the record down. Just 3 days after the 103 flat, Nicro would get the first ever 102 with a time of 102.48. This run would have stood for a long time, but there would be another trick discovered that would once again save another 20 seconds, and this time, Sui would be the first to learn and implement it into runs. In just about every kingdom, there are these moons that are only supposed to be accessible
esto va a ser Snowdrum,
but naturally, players would find ways of reaching these moons without the painting. In Snow Kingdom,
el clip este de Lake también tiene que ser muy tocho.
The Odyssey was this secret moon. It was slow, but it was really the only option. That was until it was discovered that you could actually make it to the painting moon in snow with a tight vault from the top of the Odyssey. When this jump was done for the first time, people thought that it would be nearly impossible to make it consistent.
Dice, la gente se pensaba que este salto iba a ser casi imposible. Y ahora es como un 4 de 10 en la lista de trick jumps, tío. Y ahora mismo Tyron esto se lo hace sin setups, que es una barbaridad, ¿sabes?
Didn't know at the time was that there was ways to make tight jumps like these much more consistent. By delaying your rainbow spin, you're able to prolong your time in the air, making the jump much more doable. Furthermore,
el rainbow spin tan tardío.
Vectoring also helped to prolong your time in the air, which if you don't know what vectoring is, it's fancy terminology for moving at an angle or side to side. With both the delayed rainbow spin alongside the power of vectoring, Sui was able to consistently nail the trick in his runs, allowing him to bring the record all the way down.
O sea, aquí se hacía sin vector, que es jodidísimo.
To a 102.30. Around the same time, another time save was found in Sand Kingdom. By long jumping off of this edge, you're able to spawn this bullet bill. If you
truco también me encantaba, tío.
Quickly collect this
ya no se hace así, pero me encantaba, tío.
You'll be able to home into the bullet bill and essentially warp yourself up here without having to spend the 5 to 6 seconds climbing up. Dram55, who is the person that discovered this strat, specifically asked people not to name the strat after him.
Qué bonito
so
es eso, tío.
The community not only coined this as the Dram strat, but the previous trick I just showed you would be coined as Snow Dram.
Por eso se llama Snowdram. No sabía por qué se llamaba Snowdram.
Despite him having no involvement with the discovery or implementation of that trick whatsoever. Come the beginning of June, and Nitro finally took the world record back from Sui, getting a time of 1:02:19. This was once again another solid Nitro world record that would remain untouched for quite some time. 1:01 was possible, but the margins for error were starting to become super thin. Not to mention that Nitro had to start preparing for Summer Games Done Quick, which is the biggest speedrunning event in the entire world. At this event, Nitro was going to fly all the way to America from Ontario, Canada to show his any % skills to the masses.
En el All Games
But there was
Quick.
just one problem with Nitro being at this event, and that was the fact that while he was away, one of Odyssey's biggest discoveries would be made.
Esto le tiene que reventar, tío.
An entire year, and while a lot of routes had seen some type of change, Wooded Kingdom had surprisingly remained rather stagnant.
Ya,
This was
tío,
about
el
to
clip de
change,
Wooded.
though, as a new roll
El
cancel
nut
clip
clip de
was
Wooded,
going
tío.
to be implemented into the route. After getting this nut moon, you'd go up to this rock
Buah,
and perform
claro.
a roll cancel on it. Once
Es que
out of
esto es
bounds,
mucho
you
ahorro.
could then make your way over to this sliver
lo
of
hacían
land,
por
and from
aquí.
there, you could collect this moon without using
Hostia
a tank.
puta, sí que lo hacían
Usually,
jodido.
collecting this moon out of bounds like this would cause you to soft lock inside of the little box the moon is in, but if you collect the moon by touching the very bottom of its hitbox, then you'll be able to stay out of bounds and ultimately make your way up to this part of the stage. This would once again be a dead end under normal circumstances, but with some speed and a lot of jumps, you are able to make it all the way up without a rocket flower and get this moon. From there, the route continues on as normal, and if you do all of that perfectly, you'd be looking at around 15
cambio es muy tocho, tío.
But Rock Clip would never see the light of day because an
Claro, con el rock click es súper jodido.
by accident. Robin Cyrex, who was practicing Night Metro for a speedrun, collected this moon and accidentally did a cap throw facing the wall as he was.
Lo hizo sin querer, tío. Mira, hay gente que preguntaba, ¿cómo se descubren estas cosas? Sin querer. ¡Oh!
In doing these inputs, the moon had pushed him out of
se ha quedado
bounds,
flipado, ¿no?
for a useless clip.
Useless
clip was useless in Metro.
No, tío. Uno de los clips más importantes en la historia del speedrun de Super Mario Odyssey. La primera vez que se comparte se llamaba el clip inútil, ¿sabes? Bravo. Bravo.
The moon useless would quickly begin to immortalize itself throughout the
Míralo,
run,
se usa en todos los putos reinos prácticamente, tío.
Or this one in Snow that
En Snow también, tío.
The best part about this trick was that while you only had one try to do it, there was a decent amount of leniency when it came to the timing of actually getting the clip. On the same day of this discovery, it was also found that moon clips were also possible with a triple jump, but these were much more difficult, not to mention that there weren't any that could be implemented into the any % route, but one moon clip made its way into the any % route, and this moon clip saved a lot more time over the ones in Snow and Cascade Kingdom. Using this nut moon, you could
es que este clip,
straight
tío,
out
es una
bounds
locura,
and
de bueno.
almost instantaneously make your way to the tank
Inútil a
moon. Not only
masterclass,
was this easier than rock clip, but this was much faster. While an optimal rock clip would save 15 seconds, this saved closer to 30. Since
30 segundos,
he was
tío.
unable to learn and do attempts with the new moon clips, which gave Sui the perfect opportunity to demolish Nycro's 102.19.
Buah.
Sub 1-0-2. There was
eh.
one question that was on the mind of a lot of community members. Was it actually possible that
Tío, es que ves cómo se mueven ahora y ves cómo se mueve Tyron por aquí y ha cambiado tantísimo. O sea, esta misma zona, estos simples movimientos, yo creo que es en lo que más se lo noto a Tyron, tío. Estos simples movimientos, tío. Simplemente esto, tío,
members.
Y aquí parar y tal. Como lo hace Tyron es una locura, tío. Bueno, habrá más speedrunners actualmente que lo hagan así, ¿no? Pero ha cambiado tanto el simplemente andar, ¿sabes?
The answer is yes, but during this time, the community had come to a consensus that the 80% run was starting to become.
Ese clip se hace con la animación del cap throw y por eso se mueve Mario cuando agarra la luna. ¿Cómo qué clip? El de la nuez. Que es el damage clip que se hace de la misma forma, pero al recibir un hit. Sí, el del nuevo metro, ¿no?
Absurd. Not only were these tricks starting to pile up, but runners were making way
eso ha ido muy alto.
But don't take it from me though. Take it from all of these people instead.
Not possible. Let me just say it's not. Humans cannot get sub out. We're just not gonna do it.
No.
In theory, yes, it's possible,
clips que envejecieron mal, gente.
I don't see it happening.
Clips que envejecieron mal.
Sub hour is not gonna happen. Like literally, it will never happen.
Sub hour is impossible, guys. So I mean, there's no way anyone could get sub hour. It's literally impossible. Guys.
Around this same time, a massive project was being put together by the Odyssey community.
El Subora, tío. El Subora.
Was segmented into hundreds of segments. If you clicked on the link for a segment,
la comunidad se volcó para que se consiguiese hacer el Subora, tío. Es una locura.
So once the community had gathered the fastest time for each segment, which keep in mind, some segments did things that were way outside the scope of even a world record run. The community was then able to edit and compile them all into one video. The final result was a segmented run that was completed in 59 minutes and 32 seconds.
Es el tiempo perfecto. El tiempo perfecto, 59-32.
Even when the run was split into hundreds of segments, so it was safe to say that we weren't going to see anyone.
Este vídeo creo que lo llegamos a... No sé, no, este no. Vimos una versión más moderna.
Nitro would take the record back,
but 5 days later,
Lil Curbs would snipe the world record.
But after a few months of grinding,
Nitro had brought the world record all the way down to a 101.07. 100 was possible, but would he be the first to get it? Would it be the up-and-coming Lil Curbs?
Lil Curbs jugaba al Odyssey, tío. Lil Curbs lo veo mucho por el Mario Maker.
We come back to break another minute barrier. Well, it would actually be another runner who goes by the name of Chaos Springle.
1.58.
Once Chaos got his 1:00.58, he would go on a rampage, getting one world record.
56.
After another.
52.
I fucking did it.
After another.
Eso en 2018, Un año después del Odyssey. En un año, tío.
The most impressive part about Chaos's world records were how close he was able to play to his sob, which is an abbreviation for sum of best. Your sum of best combines your best split or gold split in each kingdom, and when you combine all of Chaos's golds together, you'd get a time of 1:00.
Ahora que lo pienso, no se hace ningún triple throw cancel en los speedruns porque pierdes tiempo haciendo el tornado de fuego. Cuando te ves a Capi en su vuelta y pulsas A, C. Supongo que es más rápido. A ver, pero tampoco hay ningún salto que te requiera un trick jump tan chungo, ¿no? Creo yo. O sea, al final los trick jumps es la gente complicándose porque quiere. Pero realmente para conseguir lunas rápido no es lo más óptimo. O sea, siempre hay alguna forma mejor.
1:00.15, meaning that if Chaos played perfectly for his skill level, that he'd get a time of 1:00.15.
Lo ha recuperado para que ha hecho eso.
Was a 1:00.41, which means that throughout a run
el Snowdram.
Hour long, he
el Snowdram se podía hacer. Bueno, claro, pero con bout más rápido.
An average of 1.5 seconds per kingdom. While Chaos would go for safer strats, he had consistency that was simply unmatched at the time, as most top-level runners would play within 30 seconds to a minute of their sob, while Chaos was consistently able to play within 20 to 30 seconds of his sob, which made him a very dominant world record holder. But since we were now less than a minute away from sub-hour, a lot of top-level players started adding sub-splits, which means that there were now splits under each kingdom split. For example, in
digo, porque se ha llevado esa, si la que tiene la luna es la otra, claro, porque quieren hacer el clip.
And the rest of the kingdom, as opposed to just one cascade split. This way, they
se podía entrar por ahí, yo no sabía, tío.
Within each section of the kingdom. Players would also do ILs, or or individual level runs, meaning that they would do timed runs of each kingdom to see how fast they could bring each kingdom down. Then, if they wanted to, they could put these times into their sob, which also aided in giving a better idea of what a perfect run would look like.
Claro, estuvieron haciendo splits de speedrun a ver cuánto podían bajar.
It still seemed impossible, but when world record holders needed the community most, they came through with some discoveries that did not disappoint.
Oh, el chip
that would
clip.
make sub-hour just barely possible for a human being, and the first of these discoveries would be in Lake Kingdom. After players get this zipper moon, they make their way underwater to collect a few moons before fighting Rango for the last few moons. However, there was an insane alternative to this route. This corner in the wall has a few pixels in which Mario is able to squeeze right through it. So if you use Cappy to line up the clip and then roll forward with Mario, you could clip ever so slightly out of bounds. From here, you could do a ground pound followed up by a cat bounce, which leads you to this invisible wall that you can do a wall jump off of, allowing for you to make it all the way to this chest.
Es que no solo tocas el checkpoint, tío, es que encima pillas esto, ¿sabes?
But if you do a homing up throw after your wall jump, you're able to collect this checkpoint, in which you could then warp to this painting moon after collecting the chest moon. If you continued on with this route and then ended off the kingdom by talking to this fish lady, you could just warp straight to the Odyssey.
Sin rango.
There are now 3 individual moons routed in that replace the 3 moons you'd otherwise collect from Rango.
No ganas tanto tiempo, realmente, pero te ahorras la cinemática. Son segundos. O sea, puedes decir, buah, es que me ahorro la batalla de rango. Claro, pero tienes que pillar otras 3 lunas. No es... O sea, es algo súper complicado que ahorra muy poco. Pero claro, ya en este punto es lo que hay que hacer.
While Chaos had quickly implemented this trick into his runs, Equan, who had been a top-level player for a while now, was the first to get a new world record with the trick, getting a time of 1:00:38. This would be Equan's only record, but to put into perspective how insane
claro, aquí cualquier segundo es mucho ya.
Games that were 10 seconds better than everyone
luego
else.
Lake clip porque no me sale consistente. Uso otra ruta que tengo. No, te digo la verdad, ahorra mucho tiempo. Otra ruta. Sin la luna de Lake. O sea, sin la luna de... Bueno, el clip son 2 lunas. Yo es que pillo a rango y ya está. Cuando nos pongamos el mod de no cinemáticas, eso será rapidísimo.
In Seaside Kingdom, there was another 5-second time save discovered, but unlike Lake Clip, this new trick could be pulled off by a beginner. If you place the Cheep Cheep in this spot, uncaptured, and then recaptured, you could clip the Cheep Cheep through the floor.
¿Son 24 segundos? No. Solo no matar al rango son 24 segundos. No puede ser, tío, si la lucha de rango no dura 24 segundos. No puede ser ese ahorro, lo lasco, es imposible. O sea, la lucha de rango no dura 24 segundos. Ah, vale, 0.24, vale. Qué susto, digo, no puede ser eso. La cinemática sí dura mucho, pero no tanto como para un ahorro de 24 segundos en Lake. Ni de coña. O sea, tiene que ser 8 o 9 segundos, que ya es bastante para un speedrun, pero ya está. 24 es muchísimo. O sea, tú piensas que te saltas la cinemática de rango, ¿vale? Y la batalla, pero te comes 3 cinemáticas de luna, ¿sabes? Y tienes que ir a pillar esas lunas. Y incluso haciendo el lake tienes que teleportarte al banderín y todo. O sea, ahorras tiempo no haciendo la pelea y tal, pero no son 24 segundos ni de lejos. O sea, no se refería a eso, lo blasco de todas formas. Pero digo, no puede ser.
And from there, you could collect this crate moon while you were on your way to the bullet bill moon, which saved about 4 seconds over collecting the crate moon after Dram. This sequence of movement was arguably as complex, if not more complex, than the Lake Clip out of bounds movement. Not to mention that messing it up would mean that you would miss the bird moon you'd have to get later on in the kingdom, so there was really no room for error here. All throughout February, the world record would drop, with Nitro getting a 1:00:09 on the 21st, with there being only 10 seconds left to shave off. The racer sub-hour was on, but then
just tenían que pillar el águila aquí, gente. Nah, muy nubardos.
With the best possible time of 59:55 going into Bowser's, it was looking like this was shaping out to be the first ever sub-hour. This run had barely seen any mistakes, with there only being a few seconds lost here and there.
Es que casi sin fallos y sea aún difícil bajar de una hora, tío, imagínate.
Unfortunately, they would mess up this ogre, which killed sub-hour, or at least that's what people thought, because because they had played the rest of Bowser's perfectly, meaning that their best possible time going into Moon was just barely a 59-59.
52. ¡Ah! ¡No!
I literally beat the game in an hour.
Por un segundo,
had
tío.
beaten the game in exactly
Lil'
1
era.
hour. The breaking of this milestone was bound to happen any day, but for the next month, the world record stayed.
Seguro que puso algo en su pared, gente. El que entendió, entendió.
Just like Lil Curbs, but nonetheless, nobody was able to keep it together on sub-hour pace. But right as March was coming to a close, one of the top players would finally break through.
Dios, qué lag, ¿no? $59.59, tío. Subo 1 hora,
Fuck yes. Fuck yes.
Primera persona en el mundo en hacer su hora, chat.
Let's fucking go.
You remember how I said there came a point in Mario Odyssey's history
where
players thought that the game was dead? This very moment was that point in time. The race to sub-hour was over, and with that came the hype around the game itself fizzling out. 58 was technically possible, but there was no way that was going to happen anytime soon. And even if it did become possible, there simply just wasn't as much excitement about breaking that minute barrier in comparison to
A ver, este puede ser el momento más importante de toda la historia, creo yo. O sea, bajar de 1 hora puede ser lo más importante que le ha pasado al Odyssey de Speedrun, ¿sabes? Que sí, que luego se ha roto mucho ese récord y tal, todo lo que digáis, pero la expectación que había en aquel entonces por bajar de la hora era loquísimo, tío.
A Japanese player who was all the way in 5th place would jump all the way up to the top of the leaderboard, getting a time that was just milliseconds slower
En su momento se usaban los tases, yo creo que no, porque ni ahora mismo está el TAS muy implementado.
Chaos would not only get his first sub-hour, but he would dethrone Nitro by a second. Within that following month, Chaos would get 3 more world records, but they were all 59-57s. Other than the seconds that were left to be squeezed out of Chaos's world record, any percent did not have much going for it anymore, and it was understandable as to why the hype was dying down. But on April 25th of 2019, Mario
hemos pasado del 2018 a 19.
Unexpected turn. Up until this point, Odyssey only had 3 main versions: 1.0, 1.1,
aquí va,
and 1.2.
1.3, gente, esto lo cambió todo,
of the game because Sphinx Clip, Turnip Clip, and FMS were all patched on the subsequent versions of the game. But with the release of 1.3, there were 2 tweaks to the game that changed any percent forever. The first change was that there were now these Luigi hint arts scattered throughout the game.
Monedas
Each hint art gives 200 coins, which is insanely useful because you need a few hundred coins throughout the run so that you can buy these shot moons. The second tweak was that the game's loads were much faster.
Mira.
Point where 1.3 was now the fastest version to run the game on, despite a few of the game's tricks being
3 segundos por cada cambio de mundo, chat.
A lot of speedrunners and community members viewed this
Entonces,
change
claro,
negatively.
dices, vale, solo con Cascade no me ahorro ese tiempo, pero con los 16 mundos restantes es una barbaridad de tiempo. O sea, es casi un minuto solo por tiempos de carga, tío, entre mundos.
But since the world record was no longer safe, you can bet that other players were more than excited to take advantage of this opportunity. On May 3rd, Goryuya would get the first 1.3 world record, starting off strong with a time of 59:46. Just a few days later, Chaos would squeeze out a record of his own, but what made this particular run impressive was the fact that Chaos was 15 seconds behind Goryuya out of Metro. So if you combined Goryuya's first half with Chaos' second half, then we'd be looking at a time of 59:31. After Chaos got his 59:46, he would continue to do attempts, and within the same session, he'd get another world record. But instead of it being another small record cut, it was a 59:35. The craziest part about this run was that Chaos was still 11 seconds behind Goryuya out of Metro, which meant that there was still a lot of room for improvement. But the only problem here is that the second half of the run was second to none. Coming out of Metro, Chaos had a best possible time of 59:31, which means that for the next 30 minutes, he only lost 4 seconds. Even if Chaos didn't have golds that were as optimized as Goryuya or other players, this level of consistency in the modern Odyssey speedrunning scene is simply unheard of.
Is this a dream?
A month would pass, so while Chaos was still on top, 2 players were quickly rising to the top of the leaderboard as well. The first player was Mitch, who had just gotten a time of 59.
Mitch entra en escena. Mitch está ahora mismo, bueno, no sé si sigue, pero Mitch hasta hace muy poco estaba top 2. Igual sigue aún en top 2, la verdad.
And the second player was Tyrone18, who had just gotten 59. Both players were ahead of the record out of Metro, but unsurprisingly, they fell short.
Mitch creo que estuvo superando a Tyrone bastante tiempo.
On the flip side, they had something that Chaos didn't, and that was more strategies in their arsenal. But what exactly were these strategies, and where did they come from? Well, you remember that segmented run that clocked in at a 59.32? That was the BTT, or Best Theoretical Time, in which you could beat the entire game in the middle of 2018. By the end of 2018, a second BTT was released, with the final time clocking in at a 58.20. But in the same month, Chaos got his 59.34. A third BTT was released, and this time, the final time was a 57.32. Since the BTT was always at least 2 minutes ahead of the world record, it became a very powerful frame of reference for players such as Tyrone and Mitch. For every moon that was done in the world record, there was most likely a faster and more difficult strategy for doing said moons in the BTT.
Era esa, tío. Tienes que buscar cosas más arriesgadas.
If Tyrone and Mitch could add enough of these optimizations, then they would finally have an edge on Chaos.
Chaos is dead, boys. Oh my god.
Este es Tyrone. 59.33.
Chaos had finally been dethroned, and the person to do it would be Tyrone. The very next day, Chaos would take the world record back and keep it for another month. Then on July 8th, Chaos would once again improve the world record by a second, but this time, Chaos wouldn't hold the record for very long.
Temazo, Mitch está cuarto ahora mismo, hostia. 59-14 por Mitch, chat.
Record, and without any new time saves, he had beaten it by an entire 16 seconds. This was easily the most impressive record the game had ever seen up until this point. While this run was insanely impressive, there were some pretty notable mistakes, such as this one in Night Metro. Moments like these proved that 58 could be achieved by a top-level runner, so long as they cut down on any time loss.
El Vector ya lo están usando ahí, ¿no?
Optimization and mistake minimization were both crucial for cutting down on the record. There was one more key component when it came to these new records, and this key component would be none other than the execution. Execution can be used to describe a lot, but when I say execution, I'm talking about the speed in which inputs are being pressed. For example, let's take a look at these two spin pounds. You'll notice that the one on the right is a tad bit faster. This in itself only saves
Esto es lo que se enseñó el otro día en el task. El task lo hace en un frame, tío, y los speedrunners lo hacen en 4 o 5
frames. But if you're able to consistently do that faster spin pound, then frames quickly compound into seconds over the course of an entire run. The same logic can be applied to dives, jumps, or really any sequence of movement. Execution played a huge role.
Esto es lo que os digo que se nota sobre todo cuando ves el juego, el speedrun de ahora y el de antes, tío. Porque antes hacían más o menos los mismos trucos. Obviamente ahora hay trucos nuevos y tal. Pero el cómo se juega, tío. El instant speed pound y el roll cancel que hacen ahora y todos los movimientos que hacen son absurdamente precisos y rápidos. Por cierto, esto se ve así, tío, se puede ver mejor. No, esto es porque, claro, los speedrunners en Twitch tiene esta calidad, ¿no?
Execution is also part of the reason as to why the BTT is always minutes ahead of the record, as players will grind segments for hours.
Es que fíjate la diferencia de esto a lo que hemos visto antes, tío.
Up until this point, the longest a single record had stood for was 32 days. Come September of 2019, and Mitch had effectively doubled that number. But since it had now been over 2 months,
estas son 3 frames, tío. En el TAS lo hacían en un frame. En uno. Era en plan de, vale, uno. Y al siguiente estaban haciendo el pound. Era muy loco.
Starting to catch up, and right behind Mitch was Tyrone with a time of 59.16. While
51,
Tyrone was still
16.
short of the record, his 59.16 was on pace to destroy Mitch out of London.
Hostias. con 2 segundos de pérdida aquí, ¿sabes?
With the best possible time of 58.56 upon entering Ruined, the potential for a new record, let alone 58, was undeniable at this point. On September 18th, Tyrone would finally beat Mitch, getting a time of 59.09. The only caveat here is that Tyrone lost 12 seconds in Luncheon alone, so while it was a new record, he was unsatisfied and kept pushing for 58. By the end of September, Tyrone and Mitch both got 59.05s, but Mitch was on top by less than 100th of a second. On the 1st of October, Tyrone had a best possible time of 58.57 entering Moon, but once again, it would be another 59.0x world record. Chaos was the first 100, and Nitro was the first 59, so who was going to be the first to get 58?
Tyrone. ¡Boom! Va, Tyrone emocionándose tanto por un world record,
After
Eso ya no pasa, gente.
The first ever 58 had finally happened.
Tyrone en 2019 emocionándose por un world record. Tyrone en 2024 gana Speedrun. Es increíble. Cuando hagan el Insta Speed cuando un frame, ahí seguramente estén en la lucha porque los world records sean por varios frames. Puede ser. Puede ser. Pero es que lo del TAS es una locura en este juego, la verdad.
Tyrone was the man to do it. But if there's one thing that you should know about these top runners, it's that they don't stop when a new minute barrier is broken. They stop when they are done.
Dice que no paran cuando una de las barreras la han roto, ¿no? Sino que paran cuando hayan acabado. Y eso no pasa. ¡Una hora después! ¡Una hora después! ¡Qué bestia, cabrón! O sea, el hijo de puta se hizo un world record y en la siguiente run se hizo el siguiente world record. Temazo, estoy de acuerdo.
Just 2 days after the 58.59, the record had now dropped to a 58.47.
Qué bárbaros,
this run
tío.
was absurd, with the only real notable mistake being in Bowser's Kingdom. While Mitch would get a 58 of his own, Tyrone would put down any percent. In his own words, he had killed the category, and so it was on to other endeavors. Another player, who goes by the alias of Stravos96, was right behind Mitch and Tyrone with a time of 59.00, but as he was closing in on the record, he too would put the game down. Tyrone was the undisputed champion of any percent, and for the rest of 2019, his record would stand. Right after Tyrone got his 58.47, something remarkable happened. A player was simply just messing around in Cascade Kingdom and ended up accidentally landing on this tiny slither of ground. Once people heard about this, they immediately went the KFR, or Koopa freerunning, as being able to replicate this trick in KFR would almost certainly allow for
probando cosas inventó el Dino Skip
to fall. Come October 27th, and Hey There would beat Hamadu's world record by almost an entire second, which is unheard of when it comes to KFR. That same day, the record would be beaten 8 more times. It was clear that this trick was useful in KFR, but what about in any percent? Well, when it came to getting up to the Madame Brood boss fight, players would skip a lot of the kingdom by using this dinosaur and trampoline, but if you put Dino Skip side by side with this new trick, then this is what happens.
Claro, te ahorras la cinemática.
Any percent now had an almost 10-second time save.
10 segundos el Dino Skip solo,
DSS, which stands for Dino Skip. The trick was difficult and precise, but since it was at the beginning of the run, players could easily reset and try again. Not to mention that
es un 9 de 10. Por lo tanto, todos los speedrunners de nivel World Record hacen dream jams de alto nivel como si nada ya y se la pela,
Getting the trick second try would still save a few seconds over doing Dino Skip. Even with this massive trick being discovered, Tyrone's record would stay on top all throughout 2019 and even into 2020.
O sea, ya no solo es que hagan el Dino Skip, es que lo hacen rápido. ¿Sabes? Porque, por ejemplo, fíjate lo que han tardado aquí. Vale, haces el S, salto en pared y ni siquiera pillas la altura máxima del salto en pared y haces un dive. Porque lo que quieres es hacerlo rápido, no quieres que te salga. Quieres que te salga y quieres que te salga ya, ¿sabes?
2019 and even into 2020. That's how good the 5847 was. With it now being 4 months since Tyrone got his record, any percent seemed to have truly died. But in February
con esto les costó ganar a Tyrone, ¿sabes? Aún con esto, tío.
First he got a 5844, then a 5842, and finally a 5939, all within the span of 24 hours. 2 weeks later, Tyrone clapped back with a 5836, and after another 2 weeks, Mitch would clap back again. As the months would pass, Tyrone and Mitch would continue the trade world record back and forth,
entre Tyrone y Mitch pushearon esto una locura,
impossible given the current strats. Their execution was simply unmatched by any player in the world, but with the world entering a lockdown, maybe one of these top level players could pour
estas son las cosas que dice de la ejecución, en plan de tú llegas aquí y haces un ground pound. Pero claro, mientras tú estás saltando aquí en el ground pound, lo que ha hecho Tyrone y Mitch y los speedrunners top, aquí han hecho un spin pound. Ya están cayendo, tío. Mientras tú estás ahora girando en el aire y tal, ¿sabes? Es la diferencia, tío.
With all of these optimizations starting to add up, 57 was already on the horizon, given that it was 14 seconds away. Nonetheless, these 14 seconds were going to be insanely difficult to shave off, especially with current strats. Come May of 2020, and what arose was a potentially huge change to any percent. In the BTT, most of the kingdoms actually follow the same route as what the world record does. However, a few kingdoms have different routes, and one of these kingdoms would be none other than Luncheon. When it came to Luncheon, players would collect a few story moons. First, they do then this cheese moon, and then they end off the kingdom with this multi-moon.
Qué bonito ha hecho eso, tío.
All of these story moons are skipped. This route
Coge el tiempo que ha hecho el dive para girar el joystick. Claro, es esa. Claro, pero eso es muy jodido de hacer. ¿Sabes? Pero es la diferencia entre simples mortales. ¿Qué coño?
Problem with it, and that was the cheese room moon. Not only is the frame window for this roll cancel super tight, but the cheese moon itself is very arduous, as the Pan Bros pans aren't consistent, meaning that luck is a factor as well. But the community had a solution to this. Instead of collecting the cheese moon, you'd instead collect the shot moon, which is convenient as it is right in between these turnip moons and the crate moon. You'd still have to do this triple jump to avoid Speedrun. It's even harder triple jump that is only possible thanks to these random invisible blocks being here. And if you want to save time with the route, then you need to have top-notch execution. But if you could do all of that, then you would be lucky to squeeze out a few seconds over the old Luncheon route that was much easier. So with 57 on the horizon, Mitch and Tyrone took a crack at this route, as it was most likely their only opportunity to make 57 realistic. Around the same time, everyone started doing a different route in sand. Instead of doing Jaxie's skip with the bullet bill, players would do the moons in the reverse order, which made for an easy 2 seconds of time save. 57, while far away, was starting to look more realistic. By May, Tyrone was back on top.
El skip de la batalla lo hago con el Vault mejor, ¿no?
While this run had some glaring time save, it would still stand
a mí me preocupa más este que el de la batalla, creo.
Of being on lockdown, the world record would remain stagnant.
Pues es que se hacía esto, tío. Bueno, no, claro, esto se hace para no hacer las de la luna, ¿no? $57.42. Dios. 54, cabrón. Qué vasto.
For the rest of 2020, Mitch would be on top.
Es que Mitch es un chaval, tío.
54. After Mitch got his record, Tyrone would get a 57 of his own, but for the first time in a while, he was satisfied with not having the record, because even he knew that 57, let alone Mitch's record, was simply insane. But just because this was the last 2020 world record doesn't exactly mean that the game was inactive during this time. What's so beautiful about Mario's moveset being complex is the fact that anytime players feel as though they've ran out of new tricks, they can always go back to the lab and improve their execution alongside their
qué bonito el Snowdrum, te lo juro.
Execution within a Mario Odyssey speedrun, there will always be room to improve it, even if it becomes more difficult to improve over time. While perfection will never be attainable, 2021 was
actual, ahora es 56 y pico, ¿no? No sé cuánto es exactamente.
When Mitch got his record,
creo que hace mucho que no se bate.
A sob that was in the mid 57 2x range. Now Tyrone had a 5709 sob because he knew that if he was going to have any chance at beating Mitch, then he was going to have to go back to the lab in every single kingdom and bring his times down for each one. On January 15th, Tyrone would finally be back on top with a 57-46.
De Tyrone ahora mismo sí.
Again, Mitch and Tyrone
Pero
would
aquí
battle it out.
Mitch tuvo mucho tiempo el world record.
But on April 30th, Mitch would once again prevail with a time of 57-35. While execution was obviously stronger now, there are a few
56-06 esta hora, qué barbaridad.
Now, there's a trick that players had been doing ever since the conception
56-06 y esto es de 2021, tío. O sea, fijaos que en 3 años el tiempo se ha bajado, no llega a 2 minutos, o sea, 1 minuto y no llega a medio, ¿sabes? En 3 años, es una locura, tú.
Execution was obviously stronger now, there are a few important details.
Es una locura.
Point 3. Before starting a run, players will go into the switches menu
Hostia,
and
lo
set
del
the time
tiempo,
at
tío.
1:53 a.m. Once they enter
Esto es una
Kingdom,
barbaridad.
they plant the seed in the pot. Usually, it would take 20 minutes
Esto
for
es
the
una
seed to
barbaridad.
grow, but since the time was set to 1:53 a.m. on daylight savings, what will happen is that the clock will go from 1:59 a.m. to 3 a.m., tricking the game into thinking an hour has passed.
Dios, esto es una locura, tío.
Seed grow instantaneously. Because top-level runners would enter Sand Kingdom at 1:58 a.m., they would add an offset so that way they could plant the seed at the right time, which is 1:59
Ah, qué bueno, para eso es el offset, no sabía para qué era.
The order in which the moons are collected is 2 seconds slower than the fastest town route, which is to collect the seed after the shop.
Es que lo del cambio de hora es una barbaridad,
tío. Moons in the reverse order was definitely harder, but it was nothing in comparison to a bunch of other strategies that were already in the run. The reason as to why this wasn't added into runs for so long was the simple fact that you'd have to wait an additional 10 to 15 seconds before starting your run, because since you're collecting the seed moon sooner, your offset before you start the run becomes larger. The only workaround to this wait time would be to optimize cap and cascade enough to the point where the clock can be set to 1:54
Ese salto el cascade, o sea, el cap por la izquierda.
Nowhere near close to that being a reality.
Yo creo que el máximo se va a quedar por 54. Sí, creo que ya se hizo un sumo best de los mejores y se quedaba en 54 por ahí.
It would mean more waiting time in between attempts. In addition to reverse town,
no sé, yo creo que se descubrirá algún truco o algo así, pero es muy difícil ya. Como el clip de el Wiggler de Metro, ¿sabes?
The movement here is pretty straightforward. It was thought that the timer on the lever was too tight to have enough time to collect both moons, but with this tight triple jump, you are able to.
Ah, mira, esto se hacía en el All Moons, ¿eh? Hostia, qué bueno.
In Bowser's Kingdom, it was discovered that you could get one of Harriet's bombs to float like this. This happens when one of her bombs collides with the other.
También el que descubrió esto se coronó,
it's useful because on Harriet's second phase, you can immediately get a hit on her. But since all of these time saves and more were in Mitch's 57-35, Tyrone was either going to have to edge out the world record, or he was going to have to add a strategy that no one has ever done in runs before.
Qué puto animal, tío.
This is 2DSS, otherwise known
Esto
as
es una
2D
barbaridad de salto.
Not only is it super impressive to watch, but it is even more impressive to pull off, especially given the nerves players experience right at the end of these runs. But how the hell is this even possible? Well, you'll notice that these jumps are happening near the edges of these walls. That is because there are small and invisible fragments sticking out on both sides of the wall's edges. After you exit the 2D section, these fragments break in chunks, which allows for the walls to
todo lo que ha tenido que practicar, tío, el Tyrone en su casa para hacer eso, ¿sabes?
Section hasn't fallen down yet, then you're able to take advantage of these fragments, allowing for you to save 7 seconds if done on the first try. Tyrone had been practicing 2DSS, and he vowed to start going for it when the run needed.
Esto fue como una sorpresa para todos, tío, en plan de, mira, me lo he aprendido. Ella, el booster skip es una locura. Yo creo que alguien intentó saltar en alguna pared y saltó en una y dijo, ¿por qué? Porque justo saltas en los vértices en donde los bloques se caen luego, por donde se descuelgan luego. Entonces alguien lo haría, ¿por qué he saltado en esa pared? Hostia, he saltado por esto, a ver si puedo saltar en tal. Y al final, ¿sabes? Skip increíble.
57-25, all within the same month. Come October 2021, and while the record was still a 57-25, a new trick had been discovered in the Seaside Kingdom. If you swim behind this chest and then shake at the right time, you're able to clip straight through this wall as the chest opening will push you out of bounds. From there, you can collect both of these moons and continue on with the route as normal. This was a big discovery because not only did it save 5 seconds, but it was also easy to implement into runs. But even with a new and exciting time save, records would once again remain stagnant. Mitch was no longer playing the game, and while other people were getting better at
Aún así, o sea, yo os digo una cosa, tío, porque dices, Mitch ahora va cuarto, pero... A ver, lo tengo aquí. Mitch ahora está cuarto, ¿vale? El speedrun de Mitch es de hace un año. O sea, aparte de Tyron, durante un año solo ha habido 2 personas capaces de superar a Mitch. Y una solo por un segundo. Un año, o sea, imaginaos el nivel de Mitch, tío. Imaginaos el nivel, ¿vale? Que sí, que Tyron luego saca casi 40 segundos a ellos. Pero, coño, que en un año prácticamente nadie ha superado a Mitch. Prácticamente nadie. ¿Dónde está? Me lo he perdido. Aquí. Es una locura, ¿eh?
There were still no new world record contenders. Tyrone was the only one who was capable of sailing the ship.
Mitch was the only person who was capable of beating Tyrone, but now that he was gone, the only person who was capable of beating Tyrone, let alone getting 56, was Tyrone.
Eso lo he dicho yo siempre, tío. El único capaz de ganar a Tyrone es Tyrone.
With the next minute barrier is that these 14 seconds that needed to be saved were going to be the most difficult 14 seconds of time save the game had ever seen up until this point. If the community could better understand tricks that had already been discovered, such as this roll cancel clip in Luncheon or this clip in Snow Kingdom, then 56 would be much more plausible. But then out of nowhere, a new trick in the Sand Kingdom was discovered, and it was an easy one at that. Using a ledge grab and a well-timed throw, this platform is able to put you straight through the wall. From there, you can get these 3 moons, which would replace having to roll all the way over to the Oasis to get these 3 moons. If done optimally, this trick saved 6 to 7 seconds, which was just enough to make 56 realistically possible. Tyrone immediately got to work, and on April 28th of 2022, he would get the first ever 57 OX, getting a time of 57.09. While he lost 6 seconds in the Luncheon Kingdom, the rest of the run was immaculate. That was, with the exception of Sand. He may have only lost 1 second to his gold in Sand, but the reality was that he lost about 4 seconds here. Platform clip in itself is a trick that just about anybody can perform, but if you want to capitalize on its full time save, then the platform needs to be right next to the wall when you ledge grab.
Tienes que sincronizar el resto de tu run para que la plataforma esté justo ahí, ¿sabes? Si no tienes que esperar. Y esperar, tío, es perder tiempo.
When Tyrone got his record, he hadn't exactly figured out how to manipulate the platform with the camera, and so he ended up getting a platform clip in which he waited multiple seconds before actually getting the clip. If Tyrone cleaned up Sand and Luncheon...
Es que esto es, Tyrone tiene las manos, ¿vale? Tyrone tiene la habilidad, y hay como... 800 cerebritos, tío, que flipan con el Odyssey intentando averiguar cómo Tyrone puede bajar ese tiempo. Es en plan de, vale, tú tienes las manos, yo no puedo hacer eso, pero ¿y si? ¿Sabes? ¿Y si averiguamos cómo manipular la plataforma para que justo cuando llegues te esté chafando ya, ¿sabes? Y así va, así va. Así son los últimos 4 años prácticamente de Speedrun. Qué bonito eso. Qué bonito. 56-52. Qué mazo, ¿eh? Sub 57, tío. Tío, por 5 segundos, cabrón. Qué barbaridad.
had choked so
Qué
many
barbaridad.
records in the past, but when it came to 56, he absolutely destroyed that shit. I would say that this record made him far ahead of his time, but not even those words fully capture how legendary
O sea, hizo sub 57. ¿En qué año era esto? 2022, ¿no? Literalmente hay solo 6 personas. No, 7 personas. Bueno, 6 sin contar a Tyron, que han hecho el sub 57, tío. Desde hace 2 años, tío. O sea, la dificultad que está ahora mismo el Any% del Odyssey es una salvajada, tío. O sea, es que yo esto no lo he visto yo en más juegos. ¿Sabes? Es como, tío, yo qué sé, Breath of the Wild. Bueno, aquí está Player 5 también, que es un poquito como Tyron. Pero, tío, ni aún así, ¿sabes? Player 5 le saca 20 segundos al siguiente. Es un poquito como Tyron, ¿sabes? Y luego, 1 minuto del tiempo de Player 5, que no es que 1 minuto, ¿cuánto sería de Tyron? 56. Son 6 personas. 1 minuto más. Bueno, sí, pues el Breath of the Wild está más o menos igual, ¿eh? Lo que pasa es que el Breath of the Wild dura 23 minutos. Igual este es más impresionante, también te digo. El Breath of the Wild es una locura, tío. Hostia puta. Pero por ejemplo, otro Mario Galaxy. Pum. Menos runs, ¿no? Hostia, se sacan minutos la peña, en verdad, ¿eh? Claro, lo que pasa es que no hay 5000 runs del Mario Galaxy. ¿Esto es el Mario Galaxy normal? Es que del Mario Galaxy hay 52 runs, no 5000, ¿sabes? Igual habría que sacarlo en porcentaje. Es que el Mario Odyssey tiene 52.000 runs, tío. Igual habría que mirarlo con el Mario 64. Sí, es difícil comparar Mario Galaxy con otros juegos por la cantidad de gente que juega, ¿sabes? Pero, tío, Mario 64... pues está más o menos, ¿eh? Está más o menos, realmente. Es una locura lo de... Pues hay varias personas del Mario que rompen muchísimo. Sí que es verdad que no veo a nadie con una diferencia entre el primero y el segundo como tiene Tyron y el resto, ¿sabes? Pero sí que hay mucho loco por ahí. No me sé un juego en el que el número 1 puede tener tanta diferencia con los demás, tío. Tirso, Zelda, Totk. En Zelda, Tirso son... Oh, pues sí, en el Zelda. ¿Qué cojones? ¿Cómo ha hecho este...? En el Tirso, que es el más nuevo. No sé cómo ha hecho este tío para bajar tanto. Esto luego tendría que verlo. Hay un tío que ha bajado de 39.50, que no es Player 5, raro. Player 5 dejó de subir runs hace 7 meses. Pues el Zelda es el primer juego que veo que baja casi 40 segundos del anterior. Casi son... No, sí, 50 segundos baja. Es el primer juego que veo, tío. Pero todos los demás... Mario 64 son 20 segundos. El Mario Galaxy son, ¿sabes? La diferencia de Tyron con el resto, que son casi 40 segundos, es una putísima animalada. Claro, en un juego, es que es lo que os digo, tío. No es un juego cualquiera. El Mario Odyssey tiene 50.000 runs. 5.000 runs casi. 40 y pico mil. O sea, 4.000 y pico, coño, con el 40. No sé si podría ver los juegos y ordenarlos por número de runs. Most runs. El Mario Odyssey está en 20.000 runs. Hostias. Es de los juegos con más runs que existen, tío. Y aún así, la diferencia es tan grande, ¿sabes? Si miramos el resto de juegos de aquí, ¿no? Que es, yo qué sé. Bueno, Minecraft no sé cómo funcionará, la verdad. No entiendo. El puto Snake, tío. Voy a mirar el Celeste, que sé que es más o menos igual. Subway Surfers, ¿qué cojones, tío? Y el Mario, más o menos los únicos plataformas que hay por aquí, ¿vale? Entonces, si miramos esto, del primero al segundo se llevan 20 y pico segundos, no llega a 30. Del primero al segundo se llevan... Danimal, muchas gracias, tío, por los 11 mesetacos de resub. Claro, sí, aquí se lleva tiempo, pero es que no, tampoco sé qué quiere decir esto. Se llevan como 20 segundos IGT in game time. Ah, que será lo importante, ¿no? Como 20 segundos también. Celeste 58-35. Este se lleva bastante el Celeste. Aquí hay un tío del Celeste también muy top. Siempre hay un tío muy top en todos los juegos, ¿eh? Mario 64, vale, Mario 64, 20 segundos también. O sea, es mucho tiempo para algo con tantas runs. Del Celeste también tiene que ser un fuera de serie, la verdad. Siempre hay un tío ahí, ¿sabes? Que supera a los demás. Y el Tirso es el más bestia que he visto yo nunca. Porque son 52 segundos de diferencia. En una run de 40 minutos es una locura. La verdad. Es una barbaridad.
Was 56.55 was the new world record, and for the rest of 2022.
Cuando pases la conida, luego te tengo que enseñar el N% sin limitaciones. Sé que son todos glitches, pero sí lo veremos. Quiero ver del nuevo Zelda, a ver qué tal.
Honestly, be content if our story ended here. But when 2023 rolled around, any percent would once again change forever. While a lot of speedruns are either movement oriented or trick oriented, Odyssey any percent was about to become both. Since it had now been almost a year since the last world record, all of these tricks were being labbed out, and among them was a trick discovered all the way back in 2018. This trick would be none other than the moon clip. As we know, moon clips are predominantly done using this
ahora es cuando se empiezan a usar los más clips del useless clip, gente.
This method, they are viable to do in runs as the frame window to clip out of bounds is very lenient. But when the moon clip was initially discovered, another method of doing the trick was discovered, and this method would be none other than the triple jump method. A few triple jump moon clips were quickly found outside of 80%, which immediately led players to theorizing ones that could be potentially possible within
hay muchos aquí que no sirven de nada, pero hay otros que sí.
2 moon clips were theorized to be possible, which would add up to 11 seconds of time save. The only problem was that various people tried these clips for years, and while it was able to be done in 2-player mode,
es que fíjate, este es muy importante. Este es muy importante.
Of 2 players extra mechanics. That was until a community member by the name of Rasco79 did this.
Qué putísima salvajada. Claro, estos dos se usan, ¿sabes?
After 3 years of various community members theorizing and attempting these clips, Rasco had almost come out of nowhere and proved them both within the same week. He even helped to prove this triple clip in Lake, which saved 4 seconds over Lake clip itself.
Aquí estamos, gozándonos este videazo.
Then he'd be looking at an entire 15 seconds of time save. There was just one problem though, and that was the fact that the odds of hitting all 3 clips in a row was insanely low.
Claro, son 3 clips de nuez, bueno, de luna en el mismo reino, tío. Menos mal que es un reino temprano, ¿sabes? Que puedes hacer resets más o menos rápido, porque si no...
But what makes these moon clips so much more difficult than the other moon clips? Well, when it comes to the backflip clips, you not only have leniency when it comes to timing a cap throw that pushes you out of bounds, but the positioning of Mario is also lenient. When it comes to, let's say, maze clip, you have 1 frame to do your cap throw, meaning that the trick is frame perfect. Or in other words, you have 1/60 to do the cap throw. But even if you throw Cappy at the right time, Mario's position still needs to be correct. So not only do you need to do a frame perfect cap throw, you also need to do a triple jump that will give you the opportunity to even attempt the frame perfect input in the first place. The same can be said for the other 2 clips, with the only difference being that you have 2 frames or 1/30th of a second as opposed to 1 frame or 1/60th of a second.
Vamos, frame perfect, gente.
Cap throw.
15 días después, 5 días después, qué bestia.
Had finally been broken, not just once, but multiple times. Tyrone was not exactly satisfied with this 5641.
No estaban en 2018. El truco este se inventó en 2018, pero no se usaba en el speedrun.
Not mentioned yet. For the longest time, players in Snow Kingdom would get this moon the intended way,
y claro, y aquí va a hacer el corner clip.
4 Goombas and hitting this switch. But in 2021, it was discovered that you can actually phase straight through this part of the wall. Usually this this would be impractical as you become soft-locked upon getting the moon.
Claro, te quedas softlock aquí, ¿no? Entonces tienes que teleportarte, tienes que dejarlo para el último.
This trick ends up being super useful. The only caveat is that this trick is insanely precise. So precise that you can't just throw yourself at the wall and expect...
No, que ponía 2018, que el truco estaba descubierto. Ah, 2028, quieres decir al pillar la luna. Pues eso es para hacerlo de la fecha de la Switch.
Every time, which is why a setup was invented. The setup involves a very specific ledge grab, which is then followed up by lining the characters of the camera with this part of the wall. But
es que es muy bestia esto, tío.
Setup, top players were still afraid to add this in runs, because while you do save 4 seconds if everything goes well with the setup, it is very easy to just flat out kill the run.
Es que eso es muy jodido,
decided that it was finally time to add this trick too, and when it came to his 5641, he missed the trick but got it on the second try, which lost him about 5 seconds. This record even lost a few seconds in Ruined Kingdom, which is almost unheard of in any world record, considering the fact that this kingdom is, for the most part, an auto-scroller. Tyrone may have gotten all of the hard tricks, but he knew that he could do better. Within the same month, he would get a 5640, but after that, the entire summer would once again see a lack of world records. That was until September 12th of 2023.
56-28.
Mitch had come back to demolish the world record one last time,
Mitch,
but since his video file got corrupted, the record was completely unverifiable. So while Tyrone was still technically the world record holder, this 56-28 motivated him to really grind any percent.
O sea,
and it was
56-28 son 15 segundos menos que Tyrone, tío.
Take 3 entire months for him to tie Mitch. 2017 and 2018 showed the endless potential Mario Odyssey had as a speed game. 2019 saw both sub-hour and 58. 2020 saw 57 and 2022 saw 56. 2023 saw twists and turns, but one thing was certain.
El corner creep es el único sitio en el que siento que Tyrone sí que pierde tiempo haciendo un setup. De los pocos sitios en los que la mayoría de speedrunners hace setups, en los que Tyrone sigue teniendo que hacer un setup.
2024 would be the
2024, gente.
Grind.
Aquí en 2024 ha habido locuras. Aquí, básicamente.
Using a backflip and a cap throw, you're able to use the Mecha Wiggler to
es que esto me pareció tan loco que se descubriese 7 años después,
From
tío.
there, you could use the time in between the first and second phase of the fight to collect this moon that you would otherwise go out of your way for in Day Metro. Since this reroute also has you going to the shop, you'll save 2 seconds in luncheon as a result of there being no shop text,
por 2 segundos, tío.
On top of the 5 seconds you're already saving in Metro. While this trick was harder than, let's say, nut clip or chest
no,
clip,
5 segundos ganas por esto, tío.
Tyrone would almost instantaneously snatch a new world record, getting a time of 56:20, followed up by a 56:19 the very next day. What was once a pipe dream was now only 20 seconds away, and Tyrone was more determined than ever to bring the record down. This is where the world record stands today, and while
ahí ese es el que hemos visto ahora. Pam. Es que mira esto, tío. Es que mira esto, tío. Es muy bestia.
Is where the world record stands today, and while Wiggler Clip is the last big trick that has been implemented into any percent, at the time of this recording, a couple of small optimizations have made their way into the run over the course of this year. In Cap Kingdom, you're able to do this spin
mira, ahora hacen esto.
Block, allowing for Cappy to get stuck against it. If you then release Cappy, he will shoot straight forward into the frog,
lo que vimos en el TAS.
a second. Other parts of the game also saw refinements that I haven't mentioned yet, such as skipping the pipe in Bowser's Kingdom by doing this fancy movement, a more refined pillars, this roll cancel after you do maze clip.
¡Oh! ¡Qué coño! ¡Oh, eso es buenísimo! ¡Eso se hace ahora! Ah, vale, no, eso no se creía que había atravesado la pared. No, simplemente está ya clipeado y hace el roncalce para llegar más rápido.
Really goes on here, but ever since Tyrone has gotten his 5606, he has been pushing as hard as he possibly can to achieve 55 before the end of the year.
Como un día llega a 55 va a ser una locura.
Maybe another runner will finally catch up to and dethrone Tyrone. But as of today, 5606 is where the world record stands, and nobody is even close to it. So while this has been the history of Super Mario Odyssey world records, I have a question.
Hostia, videazo, me lo he fumado entero.
there
1 hora 5 minutos de videazo.
for when 55 happens? And will you be there for when I take over the world?
Grande. Muy guapo el vídeo, gente. Coño, qué susto. De Anton, gente. Pueden ir a verlo. Brutal, la verdad.